I think we can start. It's 5:10.
It is. Bakut and I are co-chairing this session, but we have been asked by the organizers to be sure that it's active. And so we really encourage your participation. There was a comment yesterday that many of the panels have been very quiet. We want to change that around and make it lively. So we will do our introductions, but then we really will make this an interactive discussion. One of the things, though, before I begin, is just to go over some housekeeping things. Please be sure that your comments are brief, that you have your mic on mute until you're called upon to talk. We have both the Q&A and the chat function, and both Bakut and I will be monitoring that, and we'll recognize you as quickly as we can. But let's make this an active participation and an enjoyable session. It's called Do's and Don'ts in Choosing an Arbitral Seat in the CIS. I thought that before we get into the very specifics of Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and other places, that we should talk about the beginning, which is what is a seat and why is it important? So if we can flip to that first side. Oh, good. The seat is the home base of the arbitration. It's the thing that locks the arbitration into a context. Its laws govern the procedural aspects of the arbitration and supplement the rules of the arbitration authority if that arbitration is administered. The laws of the seat largely govern the process of and rights relating to the enforcement of the arbitration award. So that is an important aspect. And the next slide. The courts of the seat have supervisory authority over the arbitration. Its courts can be arbitration friendly, that is, they can offer support to the tribunal or the parties, or on the negative side, they can be intrusive and restrict the arbitration process. This is why it is very important in choosing the seat to have a very good understanding of the jurisprudence in that location, to know whether it's going to be arbitration friendly or whether it's going to be intrusive and in effect prohibit the arbitration. And challenges to an award can be heard in the courts of the seat. As you know, Article 5(1)(e) of the New York Convention makes this explicit. It says that recognition and enforcement of an award may be refused if the award has been set aside or suspended by a competent authority of the country in which, or under the laws of which, that award was made. So there you have it. The New York Convention expressly looks to the seat for this, the question of challenges to an award. But many people confuse the seat with where the hearing must be held. Most often that is the case, that the hearing will be held at the seat. But it isn't necessarily the case. It can be held for convenience in any other location. But the seat is this home, so to speak, for the arbitration. And we want to do that first because we're going to get into the question of why is it important to look carefully at the jurisprudence of the various locations before selecting where you're going to go. And the reason is that it is important. As I mentioned, challenges can only be held in the courts of the seat. And more importantly, if you have an unfriendly jurisdiction, you're going to have a terrible time conducting the arbitration. The court will come in and perhaps prevent you from doing the arbitration. On the other hand, if you have an arbitration-friendly seat, you can expect that if you need assistance, interim measures, for example, you can go to the courts of the seat and get those interim measures. So now, having set the stage that it is important to consider the seat and not overlook it, I'm reminded of the fact that yesterday Natalia Todd at the introductory session presented a case involving Anka, a Turkish construction company, and in the arbitration clause, there was no determination of the seat. And so there was, in a sense, a battle between the courts in London and the courts in Moscow as to whether the seat was London or the seat was Moscow. And a great deal of things turned on that. And it was perhaps an oversight in the draftsman of that particular contract, that particular arbitration clause, to avoid or to overlook the fact of selecting the seat. And I must say, one of the parties must have been very unhappy to find that its intention of having the seat in Moscow was in effect overruled by a court, by the London court. And I think that it just shows that even in very sophisticated contracts, people can overlook this issue of selecting the seat. So it is important. And now I'm going to turn this over to Bakut to take us into the CIS, and we'll begin a discussion of the pros and cons, the do's and the don'ts in selecting a seat in the CIS. And again, I encourage all of you who are on this call, we now have 20 participants, to come in and step in, and we'll hear your comments as well. But first, Bakut.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining this session. Before I start my section, I just wanted to make sure that all of you, that you know that you are all panelists and you can turn on your microphone if you would like to speak and share your experiences. The idea is to have just a discussion and maybe share your experiences as to whether you have one in the CIS. My part of the presentation, concerns with Kazakh law and maybe some thoughts from my colleagues who work in Central Asia. When we prepared this presentation, we discussed with Peter as to potential factors which could impact doing an arbitration in the CIS. And my personal observation is that it looks like extreme cases are probably in the past. My overall feeling is that jurisdictions like Kazakhstan and Russia are being friendlier to arbitration. And but still, you have to be careful when you choose a jurisdiction in the CIS as to from the perspective of local arbitration law. For example, you have to be careful about weird requirements of the local law. For example, in the Kazakh arbitration law, we have a requirement to obtain state's consent or a consent from the quasi-state entities which belong to the state companies to arbitrate disputes. So basically, they have to get a consent from their regulating authority to enter into an arbitration agreement. And because you are doing the arbitration in the jurisdiction in Kazakhstan, for example, you are subject to this Kazakh local arbitration law, and a failure to obtain such consent would simply make entire arbitration meaningless. And another weird thing is that I haven't heard of anyone obtaining this consent from the state. So effectively, this is just a polite way of saying that state entities will not arbitrate disputes. Of course, this is avoided by simply arbitrating a dispute outside of Kazakhstan. But again, there are concerns that this rule concerns with the right of a state company to arbitrate. It's not just a procedural requirement. So it can potentially lead to invalidity, a failure to enforce for an arbitral award if someone seeks enforcement of it in our jurisdictions. So you have to really be careful about local law. So yeah, I guess one of the easiest ways to avoid risks like this is probably go somewhere outside of the CIS to try to arbitrate. But if you're kind of comfortable with things like this, or if your dispute is relatively simple, I think CIS could be a relatively safe place to maybe arbitrate a dispute. I haven't heard of some really outrageous cases like before, like 10 years ago, where a local court would entirely cancel an arbitral award for no valid reason. I've just done a statistical research on cancellations by local Kazakh courts of arbitral awards, and our observation is that about 95% of those cancellations concerned with failure to notify a party to the arbitral proceedings. And mostly it concerns with small local arbitral institutions, which was a popular practice in Russia as well until recently. As I understand, in Russia, they limited the scope of arbitral institutions and to avoid this same situation, but we still have it. So basically, you can have a bunch of maybe tens, hundreds of small arbitral institutions which can issue whatever judgment they want, and they can be created under a specific bank or maybe financial organizations to issue whatever judgments that they require. So most cancellations concerned with them, but I mean, it's very rare when some established local arbitral institutions arbitral award is canceled. It's really very rare. In terms of arbitrability, it's relatively straightforward. It concerns with all matters which are considered to fall within civil law matters. Well, obviously, bankruptcy doesn't fall into this. Corporate disputes fall into this. We haven't had problems with corporate disputes. There might be issues with disputes relating to the right to real estate. Because under Kazakh civil procedure law, and the same thing I think existed in Russia as well. I don't know if there have been any developments since then. It falls into exclusive jurisdiction of the local courts to decide to resolve disputes related to rights to real estate. So there you can have issues. And again, behavior of local state courts, it's relatively, well, it's not too common when local courts grant injunctive relief in aid of ongoing arbitrations, but I wouldn't say that the situation is really so bad. Sometimes you get it. So, well, you do not get too much support, but I don't know, Peter, could you give examples of what kind of state support from state courts you usually require during an arbitration, for example?
Well, I think there are discovery issues. There are also interim measures that have to be taken. I mean, clearly, an arbitral tribunal doesn't have the power to enjoin somebody from doing something. You may have a question of documents that could be taken out of the jurisdiction, or you also have issues of being able to get witnesses, subpoena power, things like that. You really need the court. So the question again is whether you can go to the court, whether you can expect the court to grant an interim measure that is necessary to continue your arbitration.
Okay. Well, in our experience, we rarely do that, maybe just because it doesn't make sense doing that with a Kazakh court, because you won't be able to get that kind of support, maybe. The maximum thing you can get is maybe injunctive relief if you're lucky. Others, I'm not sure. Maybe there are colleagues from Kazakhstan who could also share their experience. In terms of Belt and Road, I haven't heard of Belt and Road projects being subject to mandatory Chinese arbitration. Have you heard of anything of it? I haven't heard, really.
Well, as you know, the Belt and Road is it's been reported to be a $7 trillion project over many, many years. It's certainly not defined very tightly, but and it certainly is going to have a great impact in Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia as China tries to create or is in the process of creating infrastructure to be able to move its products from China to Europe and beyond. And as we all know, construction contracts are rife with disputes, and we can expect that over time there'll be many, many disputes arising out of these contracts. And the question I have is whether, for example, a project in, let's say, Kazakhstan, a dispute arises, whether there is some sort of mandatory feature that requires that contract dispute to be resolved in China as distinct from being resolved in Kazakhstan.
Well, you know, I really haven't heard of that. What I know that usually Chinese clients, well, of course they insist on China, but usually most of those disputes, they end up somewhere in Hong Kong. But I really haven't heard of anyone being really required to accept, for example, the jurisdiction of CIS-Related.
I can ask the the 24 who are participating in this session, does anyone have any experience in this regard with Belt and Road?
All of you can speak. You can turn on your microphone. I've transferred you into co-panelists.
All right. Well, it's a fairly new thing. I think we should, at least I will certainly, and I'm sure Bakut will keep our eyes on this, because we can expect that there will be a great deal of activity in Belt and Road, and that construction contracts do give rise to disputes.
Okay. Okay, let's go to the next slide. You know, when I was preparing for this presentation, for the session, I tried to understand what is the scope of issues that you can have, I mean, risks which you can have in a local jurisdiction like Kazakhstan, or maybe a larger CIS. And the general observation is that main issues are with enforcement. And the risk of having the award set aside by the local court. There is a quick fix in Kazakhstan to that, and some of you probably have heard about the Astana International Financial Center. You know, well, the Kazakh government did not decide to, they decided to do a shortcut. They didn't want to change the entire judicial system and, you know, spend a lot of time trying to reform it and clean up and things like that. They simply set up the IFC, and they said anyone can submit their disputes to the AIFC arbitration or AIFC court, and we will hire judges from England, and they will try cases based on English law or AIFC law, based on principles of English law, or whatever law you choose. It can be Kazakh law as well. And the main benefit of the AIFC court from dispute resolution perspective in AIFC arbitration is that a judgment or issued by AIFC court is considered to be a local judgment, is equal to a Kazakh court judgment. And arbitral proceedings held within the framework of IFC are subject to the exclusive jurisdiction in terms of cancellation of the award, in terms of enforcement, are subject to the AIFC court. So basically, only the IFC court has the right to oversee the arbitral proceedings within the IFC court. And because the IFC court is composed of English judges, you would not expect any hostility towards arbitration during proceedings there. So, there are examples when it was tested. So far, so good. But it looks like the major issues associated with enforcement and cancellation of the arbitral award once it is issued are fixed by the system. So if you submit there, for example, you could have a dispute between a Chinese company and a Russian company, for example. If you need a neutral seat, then you could potentially submit to AIFC. Except for the minus 40 degrees centigrade in winter, overall it should be fine. And that award will have will be equal to a Kazakh state judgment if you're seeking, if, for example, it's a construction project in Kazakhstan, then it will have a similar effect, and you will not risk that it's going to be refused recognition or enforcement. So this is the kind of thing. And as I mentioned, the good thing is that it gives you flexibility. You are not supposed to choose AIFC law because there have been many issues about the practice, judicial practice associated with the application of AIFC law because it's too new. So you can submit whatever law you want and have it tried by the judges or the arbitrators.
Baku, did you have any statistics on how many cases have been submitted either to the AIFC court or to arbitration at the AIFC? Well,
you know, they publish on their site that they have overall 197 to this date mediation arbitration cases. How many of them are arbitration cases, I don't know, because arbitrations are confidential. We really do not know how many of them kind of are complete at which stage. We know only of maybe a couple of cases tried by the court, by the AIFC court. and this statistics is publicly available. But there's really no information on the arbitration. But we are actively introducing AIFC arbitration clauses into our contracts with clients.
And now, 2 questions. Are the AIFC court, are those hearings public?
Yes, they are public. There are, if I'm not mistaken, 9 judges hired from England. They sit and well, basically they are very similar. The AIFC court and AIFC arbitration, except that if you submit to the AIFC court, you are automatically subject to AIFC law unless you opt out of the AIFC law. And the second thing is, if you submit to AIFC court, you are subject to English High Court civil procedure rules. And the proceedings will be in English because the judges are English, are British. And if you are submitting to the AIFC arbitration, you are more flexible. You can choose procedural rules in the way you want. You can choose language. You can choose arbitrators. They have a panel of arbitrators from whom you can among whom you can choose. But as I understand, you can also choose someone outside of the list of the recommended arbitrators. So basically, you can have your hearing somewhere in Shimbulak in Almaty, but still fall within the subject of within the jurisdiction of the AIFC.
Now, in this era of COVID and all the restrictions, can you have remote hearings either at the court or at the arbitration portion of the AIFC?
Yes, I think they are doing them remotely currently. I know that they didn't adopt any changes to their regulations relevant to online proceedings, but I don't know. I know that they conduct online proceedings.
Mm-hmm. And now, is it the case that the English judges come to either Astana or Almaty to do this?
Well, at least before the COVID situation, they used to come. I don't know how they're working currently. Mm-hmm. But they usually attend hearings when they have those here.
Right. You mentioned the minus 40 degrees at Astana. I suppose if it could be done remotely, you avoid that problem.
Well, yes, of course. But the court, as I mentioned, is not too active at this stage. I think it's mostly the arbitration.
Arbitration side.
Right. We have something in our chat. We have a question from Gene Berg. He says, I have a question if there are any specific issues with deciding applicable law in CIS arbitrations when parties did not choose one. Well, I think it's a matter of really local law and local practices. My personal observation based on the analysis of Russian law and Kazakh law, and one interesting thing is that civil codes of Russia and Kazakhstan are relatively similar. At least they were same in 1994. So because there is a lack of judicial practice in Kazakh courts, we usually look into what is happening in Russia, how Russian courts interpret Russian law, and we find similar provisions in Kazakh code and apply it in the same way. So my overall observation from the analysis of Russian law and practices is that Russia really gives you a considerably larger degree of predictability in terms of overall civil law and particularly in arbitration as well, except for maybe some extreme cases where things can go wrong. So my personal observation is that maybe AIFC arbitration could be like #1 if you are going to CIS, because it really closes major issues, although it hasn't been tested. And second probably is arbitration in Russia. I think I would go maybe for Kazakhstan, maybe third. Mm-hmm. And in replying to Gene Bird's question, I think you really need to go into local law and see. I'm not an expert in Russian law, so really not in position to comment on that. From Kazakh law perspective, the situation is relatively straightforward. You have a list of cases where a local law is chosen, and if you cannot specify, it's law which is most relevant to the situation, and then you choose one.
Bahit, can I have a question, please, to you?
Sure.
This is Leonid Kropotov.
Hi, Leonid.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. And have you come across any precedents of enforcing AIFC arbitral awards in Russia or in other CIS countries so far?
Well, we are in very close contact with the register of the AIFC. Frankly speaking, I haven't heard of them enforcing anything in Russia. I know absolutely that they enforced judgments in Kazakhstan. They were relatively smooth, but really no experience in relation to Russia. You know, I can go back and check if they had ones, and we could go back to you. If you send me your email, I can get back to you on this.
Yeah, thank you. And any experience with other CIS countries, not only Russia? So there are a number of those. I do understand that AIFC is pretty young arbitration center, right? But
right.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. We have.
Well, frankly speaking, this Peter coming in here, I think that if you were considering, for example, Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, you would be very, very concerned about the courts, the question of political influence. You really just don't know. And I think perhaps that was a reason why the AIFC was set up in the first place, was to take it out of the context of local judges and politics, and to try to, in effect, sanitize it and make it standalone and no longer subject to these influences. I mean, I guess I would be very concerned that in some of the other CIS jurisdictions that you really don't know going into it whether you are going to be able to successfully enforce an award.
Right. We have a raised hand from Islambek. Islambek, you can turn on your microphone and raise a question if you have one.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon for everyone. I would just like to add about the Uzbekistan experience on that. Maybe you know that in Uzbekistan were established a new international arbitration center. This is the Tashkent International Arbitration Center. It was established in 2019. As I remember, and it has a good experience at time. There's more than 10 cases, which is ongoing cases at time. And the Uzbekistan is also the arbitration-friendly country, but there in our country there was a law on domestic arbitration. But last week our parliament adopted a new law on international arbitration. And the Tashkent International Arbitration Center were established according to the presidential decree and have a good basis for its activities. And all of its awards are enforced in Uzbekistan, and also in Uzbekistan in its civil procedural and economic procedural codes, there is regulations of the enforcement of the international arbitration awards. And I can say that according to the statistics that there is more than 90% of all international awards which comes to Uzbekistan are totally enforced. I would like just to add this about the Uzbekistan experience.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That's terrific. We very much appreciate your comments.
Well, you know, we in Kazakhstan really like Tashkent. You know, have you been to Tashkent, Peter?
Yes, I have, but during the Soviet period.
Okay, well, I haven't been in the Soviet period, but I really love the city, so it would be great to you know, seriously to combine Tashkent, Plov, and local tea with doing arbitration. I think it would be great.
In effect, that gets down to your final comment on your slide, restaurants, hotels, etc., and temperature. I'm sure that people would be very interested in going to Tashkent for that purpose, for the purpose of an arbitration.
Please tell us about your experience. I mean, in soft factors. Maybe other panelists could also speak. Rupert, maybe you have comments. What are the soft factors in choosing a seat of arbitration? Is there a place in the CIS which you would really love to visit and combine it with an arbitration?
Well, I always enjoy visiting every country in the CIS, and I've been to Tashkent, I've been down the Silk Road, and if I ever had an arbitration in Tashkent, I'd certainly take the opportunity to retrace my steps down the Silk Road. But on a more practical basis, I think certainly the accessibility in terms of travel, the easier it is for me to travel from London, in terms of flight connections as well as travel time, that will be a factor. Of course, all of these issues need to be considered at the contract stage, and it's got to be considered, therefore, usually by the corporate colleagues who, if they're sensible, will also discuss it with their dispute resolution colleagues. And I think that's something we often overlook, is that these clauses are put in without this sort of sophisticated level of thinking when it comes to choosing a seat, whether it's in the CIS or elsewhere.
We haven't discussed Kiev. I happen to be doing several arbitrations in Kiev, and I find that a very friendly place to visit, and the accommodations are just fine, first class. Getting to and from Kiev is not difficult. So, you know, on that score, I rate it very high.
Okay, dear panelists, do you have any experiences to share? And one of the key questions to me, as a citizen of the CIS country, is: are there any other factors, or maybe which are the key factors which could impact your decision to choose a place in the CIS as a seat of arbitration? Is it only the regulation, or maybe some other factors which we didn't mention in our presentation during the session?
Hi, Bakit. Conrad Rogers. I didn't particularly have further experiences, Charlotte. I found that discussion very interesting, but I'd be interested in your views and also the views of other panelists on the extent to which, even after, well, obviously as the crisis continues, but even afterwards, that there's going to be a shift towards virtual hearings, because I think that's something that we're seeing discussed a lot in England going forward. And I think people's views have generally been fairly positive about how well, certainly in arbitration, the infrastructure has worked for these remote hearings and for these virtual hearings. And rather than people having to take the time to travel and go these huge distances and the additional costs involved. So I'd just be interested for your views on that.
Well, you know, I can speak of Kazakhstan, and in Kazakhstan, AIFC, I'm not kind of promoting AIFC arbitration, but I'm objectively comparing it with other arbitral institutions, domestic ones. And the AIFC really stands apart because it's financed by the state. They have a very, very good, you know, technical background, technical preparation, and court hearings. And I think they probably stand equal, or maybe are very close to Western arbitral institutions in terms of facilities and whatever. Local other arbitral institutions are probably not. In terms of online proceedings, you know, I need to go back and check as to whether they're considering maybe shifting to online proceedings on a more or less permanent basis over time. Didn't think about it. Well, let's see. You know, I have been relatively conservative about AIFC court, but you know, I really try to find potential weaknesses of it, and I haven't found one, at least so far.
I think that we have entered quite a revolution in arbitration in general, with the COVID restrictions and the concurrent moving to remote aspects. I think that going forward, certainly many of the things that precede the hearing, the date of the hearing, will be done remotely, and I think much more efficiently. So, for example, the preliminary conferences, requests for discovery issues and the like will now, I think, regardless of whether we have restrictions, pandemic restrictions going forward, they will be done remotely, because the idea of flying for 6 or 8 hours to attend a 3 or 2 hour discussion over some preliminary matter doesn't make sense, and will continue not to make sense. And I think that a lot of that will be done remotely. So I think that even if we go back to actual hearings, that much of the arbitration process will be done using technology, using video conferencing, and that if, for example, you have an arbitration in Almaty, that the only time people will go to Almaty will be for the actual hearing, in a situation where we no longer have the pandemic restrictions. Which of course makes the possibility of doing these things in places like Almaty much more attractive.
Okay, Rupert has raised a hand. Rupert?
Yeah, thank you, Bakit. Actually, I've got a question for you, and it's about the AIFC. How busy is the AIFC at the moment? How many cases are being referred to it? And even if it is still a little bit early for cases to work their way through the pipeline, is it your experience at the moment that companies, whether state companies or private companies, are actually putting the AIFC into their contracts?
Well, you know, Kazakhstan is an authoritarian state, and state companies are effectively being forced to introduce AIFC clauses, but I'm sure AIFC management will not be happy about me telling this. But I mean, this is true. They're massively introducing AIFC clauses into their contracts, and I think it's just a matter of time when those arbitration clauses will be invoked. In terms of how busy they are, at least they put on their website that, as I mentioned, they have 197 cases, mediation and arbitration cases combined. How many of them are arbitrations? How large are they? I don't know, because they don't disclose this information, but I think they are gradually improving their workload and overall experience, maybe. Well, you know, I think you should maybe look into the practicalities. For example, my personal observation is that you do not choose AIFC for multi-billion-dollar maybe disputes, but for disputes which are economically more feasible to try to refer in Astana, for example, economically, or maybe for some other reasons, maybe because the parties are local. It would be too expensive for everyone to travel to London. For that kind of cases, I think it could give you a really good alternative. It might not be as good as maybe SCC, ICC, or London in all other respects, but overall it could be not a bad alternative. But again, time will show. I don't know if I was able to reply to your question, Rupert.
I see Leonid has raised his hand. Leonid?
Right.
Yeah, a related question actually, Bahit, you have mentioned that IFC is put by state-owned or state-related companies in their arbitration agreements, and probably this is one of the sources of the caseload for the center. But well, given the Russian experience and also probably in some other CIS countries, the question is, given that the center is also financed by the state, if I got you right, are there any speculations in Kazakhstan on how this work? So the center is financed by the government, and also state-owned entities are going to the center to
I got your question.
disputes. Yeah,
I get it. Well, yes, the center is largely financed by the state, if not entirely. And there is, of course, risk that policies of the state can change. AIFC can no longer be supported by the state, maybe the new president. And as you know, we have a new president in presidential elections in the next maybe 4 or 5 years. Everything can change, but I think whether or not AIFC will continue to exist, it will exist. Whether it's going to be as supported as now, I don't know. Whether there is risk of intrusion or maybe some influence on arbitrators or the administration in terms of if there are disputes, important disputes involving the state, I really personally doubt that it could happen, because the AIFC court is comprised of judges who have serious experience in the UK. Unless they start supporting the Kazakh government, I don't know. And you can choose the arbitrators. So from that perspective, I really don't know how you can, for example, influence an experienced foreign arbitrator to try your case, who was appointed by yourself. So from that perspective, I really don't see a risk of maybe some influence. I don't listen. Well, I haven't heard of anyone really complaining about this. Most of the complaints concerned with lack of experience with AIFC. People really don't know how it's going to work out in practice. They don't want to be tested, and that's why they simply take the position, let's just try LCA because it has existed forever and it's going to work. But you know, I had a case just 2 days ago. I have a client who has a major insolvency case, a major debt recovery case. They have claims against the Kazakh company for $180 million. They have basically two routes. They have an arbitration clause which refers to LCIA. If they go the arbitration route, they will spend 1 year in the arbitration, and by the time they will come to Kazakhstan, there will be no assets left. And even if they get the award from the LCIA, the debtor is an influential person in this country, and it's possible that that arbitral award will not be enforced for whatever reason. So in a situation like that, I think what AIFC offers you, the fact that the arbitral award of the AIFC will have the effect of the Kazakh state judgment, I think it's a better option. But is it better overall? I don't know, really.
Yeah, just commented on the issue of state financing. Singapore finances Maxwell Chambers, and Maxwell Chambers is certainly highly regarded. So I think that the mere fact of state support isn't necessarily dispositive of how the center will operate.
Okay, any other comments, any other views?
Just another comment about Singapore. You know, many years ago, before Maxwell Chambers became so well known and recognized and appreciated, the same comments were being made. I mean, how can you really rely upon what Singapore does? Is they're not going to be influenced from the government and all? And the experience there shows that a center can develop and can gain world-class reputation as being honest, straightforward, efficient, and a place in which to arbitrate.
We have a comment from Islanbek, from Uzbekistan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like just to add that there is a good perspective for CIS countries in this sphere of arbitration, because at time in CIS we don't have such a centers which is very popular, but the connection and the situation in CIS and the countries are making the business with foreign countries, etc. And in this regard, there is a good opportunity that the business entities, etc., in their international commercial relations will put the arbitration clauses of the neighboring countries. Because in our mentality and during the business activities, most companies wouldn't like to have their case in that country in which they are making business or their partner are situated. So because of that, there is a perspective like in the companies from Uzbekistan who are making business with Russia, they can choose the Nur Sultan, so Astana, as a place for arbitration like AFC arbitration. And also there's a perspective in such regard that the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and others who are making business with related countries, neighboring countries, could choose the Tashkent, Uzbekistan as an arbitration place. And I think this is the main perspective at time. And it was mentioned that there is a needed time that these arbitration centers should show their practice, should show their experience, and to become more popular. And in this regard, other countries will be interested to solve their cases in these places. And one of the maybe positions of to come to these countries are to see these countries, like in Uzbekistan. And if we will take Tashkent, it was mentioned that it's always people like to come here because a good weather, a good infrastructure, a good food, and places where you can go, you can visit like a tourist. So I think this is also interesting situation, because this is also in Singapore. When you go to Singapore, you always know that you can visit some places, you have get fun, etc., etc. And I think this is also the issue to the develop of the arbitration, and to show that the country are arbitration friendly, and people could get also fun, and will have the places to go if they will come to this place.
Islandik, thank you. Comment. Do you have? I mean, could you please share your observations on Uzbekistan arbitration law? Do you have any strange provisions? For example, in our Kazakh law, which doesn't apply to AIFC, we have things like the principle of legitimacy. It's a weird thing, but there is a speculation that an arbitral award can be cancelled on the basis that it's erroneously drafted from the perspective of law. So and it can potentially lead to a cancellation or things like that. Do you have anything like that in your law? At least, have you heard of it?
So at time, I was in the working group which prepared this law, but I haven't seen the last version, which were adopted by the Senate last week. It should be signed by the president this week, and then I can tell you that what it's have. But when it was ready, we sent it to the arbitral, and they proved that it's totally correct according to the model law, and there wasn't such definitions or rulings which are not mentioned in the model law.
Great.
So it is mostly based on model law.
You know, well, we had a similar case in early 1990s, where if you look at Kazakh laws drafted in the early 90s, they were really very liberal. And then when the oil money came, they have become very authoritarian. So I hope that Uzbekistan will not follow the same route, and then your laws will really stay as they are currently. I think we have 2 minutes left. I think we do maybe some say thanks to the participants, you know, to avoid the weird situation, awkward situation of everything turned off.
Let me say that this has been a terrific discussion, and I think we have certainly met the organizers' request that we have a participatory session. I've learned a lot, particularly from Islambek, about what's going on in Uzbekistan. It's great. This is the way seminars should be conducted, because each of you has experience that benefits all of us. So I want to thank all of you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we still have just 1 minute left. If anyone has any comments in relation to the latest development in Russia, please let us know. And we really enjoyed this session as well. So, any other comments? I think we don't have any further comments. Well, okay, Peter, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your company, and everyone else.
Bakut, I support that. I enjoyed very much working with you. It's terrific that in this day and age, we can cover 10 hours of time zones in an instant and meet people around the world. As I say, this development is going to be with us for a very long time, and it's going to change arbitration tremendously.
Right. Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm sorry, my camera turned off and it's not turning on, so I cannot show my hand.
We may all now leave the meeting.
Right. I'm just trying to put down email address from Leonid Kropotov, copy it to get back on the AIC.
Good.
Statistics. We have a new message. Okay. Okay. Now I need to learn how to put everyone outside of the of the room.
We will be cut off in just a minute.
Okay. So I'm turning off